Tonight on the Worldview Weekend Hour, Biblical Values and Social Justice, a new organization called And Campaign. It's all about social justice. It's really nothing more than two Democratic operatives connected back to Barack Hussein Obama who are repackaging the message of the cultural Marxist Democrats to penetrate evangelicalism and flip the evangelical church to their cause. This is nothing less than propaganda. The Worldview Weekend Hour begins right now.
WVW-TV presents the Worldview Weekend Hour with Brannon and Howse. Whether the topic is law, science, government, economics, history, family, social issues, education, or theology, Brannon brings the issues of today into clear focus through the lens of a biblical worldview. And now, here is your host, Brannon Howse.
Welcome to the program. Glad you're with us. I'm Brannon Howse. Joining me tonight is Tom Littleton as we talk about something we've been warning about for many years with grave influence, religious Trojan horse, the coming religious right, Marxianity, and that is this continued campaign to penetrate evangelical churches, to penetrate the hearts and minds of American Christians and flip them. We know as a matter of fact that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover warned in Christianity Today in October of 1960 to be on the lookout for communists to penetrate American churches. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, Christianity Today, October 4th, 1960 said, quote, "Look, the communists are saying we are tolerant of religion. We do not want to attack your faith. Rather, let's work together on issues in which we are both interested. Peace, civil liberties, economic justice. We communists are believers in love, justice, and the brotherhood of man. Let's not fight, but work together." Here is the deadly come-along of communism directed today at the Christian pulpit. This enables the party, meaning the Communist Party, this enables the party to move close to unsuspecting ministers and laymen who see only the exterior verbiage and not the concealed danger. How does the party work here? In many ways, encouraging churchmen to endorse, support, and even participate in communist front groups, end quote. Well, my friends, I think we can say without any doubt at all that the Democrat Party is nothing less than a communist front group. Go look at the Communist Manifesto and then the platform of the Democrat Party. It's a communist front group. That's what I believe. I think history will bear that out. And in the 1970s, Gus Hall, the Communist Party leader, the man that was the leader of the Communist Party USA, openly stated that they would take the left wing of the Democrat Party, merge it with the Communist Party USA, and then a third group that he called independent political forces. Independent political forces were groups that were more committed to various individual causes than they were a political party, like amnesty for illegals, social justice, environmentalism, whatever it might be. We'll go grab those groups and we'll make their cause our cause and add them to our three-legged stool of the far, far progressive side of the Democrat Party, the Communist Party, and independent political forces. And he said, by doing this, we'll take over. Well, my friends, there is no longer a left wing or a progressive wing of the Democrat Party. It's now been completely taken over, just as the Communist Party USA and presidential candidate Gus Hall predicted back in 1972. Well, one way they're making sure they keep adding to their coalition and to flip the church in America and largely to flip the South. Folks, this is the agenda to take over the South. Why? Because that is where they're losing elections in those red states. That's where they're losing electoral colleges of votes, the red states. So they must penetrate the South and evangelicals in order to have a complete revolution in America. Joining me tonight is my friend Tom Littleton. Tom, welcome back to the studio.
Thanks, Brannon. Good to be with you.
You want to comment on that opening statement?
Well, it's obvious that what you've said is true. This is highly political and in its end game, and we're seeing it ramp up more and more as we head into the 2020 election. Christians are clearly the target. Conservative Christians who vote with conviction Obviously, we're the problem that stands in the way of them achieving these goals. Pulling us left is critical to us seeing much more advancement of these progressive political goals. I think with the AND campaign, we found something that is one of the key players in this effort. And so people need to look at this. We would want you to go to the website not to be informed, but to inform yourself and see what this is really about and how it's trying to influence the evangelical vote.
Well, we've got a lot of screenshots, folks. Tom and I have spent quite a bit of time putting this broadcast together, and it's going to move very, very quickly. And let's go to the first screenshot. Here it is, Tom. Biblical values and social justice. This is right from the AND campaign website. Notice what they're really saying here is if you embrace biblical values, you will also embrace social justice. And yet we know social justice is nothing more than socialism. It is a term coined by Jesuit Luigi Tapernelli back in 1840, 8 years before Karl Marx released his Communist Manifesto. Social justice means socialism. So they're saying if you have biblical values, you will also embrace, well, socialism as well as the other issues that empower people through redistribution of wealth and redistribution of power, like amnesty, more public housing, more social programs, on and on they go. So if you're wanting to have biblical values, it better include socialism, correct?
Right. And if you're not, of course, then you're lacking compassion. We see that as a big part of the narrative. If you're a truly compassionate Christian, then you have to embrace social justice according to their talking points here. What's really sad is to see how this is working among young Christians. Of course, we see that we're dealing with it with a whole generation who sees social justice as the great cause of humanity and civil society. And in fact, they really don't know what it means when they use the terminology. I can tell you the AND campaign, when they're wedding it with biblical values, they know exactly what it means. They know where they want to take this and where they want to take the church.
And just a little teaser, it's not just the young folks. We got people like Marvin Alasky of World Magazine. Marvin Alasky involved in this.
Yeah, that's news for a lot of my PCA friends, I'm sure, because Marvin Alasky, editor of the World Magazine, very respected, highly read among PCA, Presbyterian Church of America, friends of mine. Some churches actually endorse this as the main source of news for Christians. Of course, we've had some problems with Marvin Alasky for a while.
Why?
Well, he is the guy who really launched George W. Bush into the faith-based partnership ideology in Texas when he was governor, and then later as president through his book, The Tragedy of American Compassion. Basically, we're doing charity all wrong. The Christians are haphazardly engaging their efforts with charity and with helping the poor and so forth. So the way to centralize and plan and control that would be through the three-legged stool. And so he's promoting the Drucker ideology and the faith-based partnerships and basically brought about it through the George W. Bush administration through executive order, which then the President Obama was able to take that program and charge it with every political progressive narrative and cause in the book, which we see reflected here in the AND campaign.
And of course, what we're talking about with Marvin Alasky is really the three-legged stool, as he said, of Rick Warren, Peter Drucker, Bob Buford, Tim Keller, Bill Hybels, government, corporations, and the private sector, or the social sector, churches. Government, corporations, and the social sector, nonprofits, churches. What's also called public-private partnerships, which is a big part of Agenda 21, now called Agenda 2030, that we deal with in our documovie Siege at siegethemovie.com. If you want to watch the free trailer, 67 minutes, you can watch various parts for free at siegethemovie.com. It's that three-legged stool, big government, big business, and the nonprofit social sector churches. And that's what Marvin Alasky, I think, was really pushing, along with many others. And he's been pushing Gaboni, as you'll see in the screenshots coming. Well, speaking about the faith-based initiatives, isn't there a guy that was with Barack Obama in the faith-based initiatives that was a part of this?
Well, it's interesting that you should say that, because actually Michael Ware, this is his book, Reclaiming Hope, we find him as one of the leaders of this movement with the AND campaign. So he is now, since 2017, he's become a key figure in the Gospel Coalition. So he's pulled a lot of conservative Christians already in. His book, Reclaiming Hope, is endorsed by Tim Keller, who is the guy who co-founded the Gospel Coalition. It's also endorsed by an assortment of liberal guys like Andy Stanley and Joel Hunter. But besides Keller, among the Gospel Coalition leaders is Russell Moore. He says, he's the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberties Commission. He said, "We can hope, and this book can help us." Well, this book is written by the guy who actually oversaw the faith-based program, faith-based partnership program, and the conservative evangelicals who were brought into it.
For Obama.
Under Obama, and he was actually boasting in the opening of this book how key to the Obama administration's faith goals that the faith-based partnerships would be. He opens up in the prelude talking about sitting down with human rights campaign leaders and
which is a radical LGBTQ Marxist group,
right? And yes, and sitting down with Frank Page, who was the CEO of the executive committee of the Southern Baptist Convention, and with Islamic leaders. So they know that this was a big melting pot, and they were going to fill that pot with money and bring it to a boil. And so that's 2009, 2010. Now, less than a decade later, we see conservative members of the church openly embracing something like AND campaign that crystallized in the faith-based partnerships and now is being openly promoted as conservative Christian views, or the middle of the road, the third way, where we can all come together in the sweet spot. And,
so not
and
Republican,
save society.
not Democrat, but a third way. Not pure capitalism, not pure socialism, but a third way, a mixture, a Hegelian dialectic or synthesis that we talk about all the time, which I know we talk about it all the time, folks, but it is their number one strategy. It really is, is it not?
It is. And
pitting people against each other, pitting ideas against each other till they synthesize and keep moving to the left.
Right. And that's the thing. It's never coming back to the right.
No.
And we'll show you with some of the graphics how the right isn't even represented in this narrative.
Yes. But the key is that this guy, Michael Ware, was Barack Obama's faith-based initiative guy.
Right.
And Marvin Olasky was doing that with George W.
Right.
And this guy, Michael Ware, is doing it for Obama. That's the three-legged stool: government, corporations, and the social sector, nonprofit churches, to really bring in a corporate fascism, if you will. Peter Drucker said the missing model has been the nonprofit social sector Christians, the great management guru Peter Drucker, and who influenced all these guys, who said he wasn't a Christian, by the way, as we've discussed in other programs. So this guy is one of the guys involved in the AND campaign. Well, here's their vision statement: to improve how Christians engage politics and culture, and to disrupt America's socio-political arena by asserting the justice and righteousness of Jesus Christ, end quote. Well, that's a bunch of malarkey, because this is nothing more than progressive cultural Marxism, so they're going to make Jesus into a social justice hippie. But notice they say the word disrupt. That's exactly what this is all about. To go in, disrupt, throw things over, turn the tables over, and then rebuild it. This is exactly what Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist, the Frankfurt School followed, or Saul Alinsky, who studied Antonio Gramsci in the Frankfurt School. You go in, you create chaos, you tear down the old values, as Herbert Marcuse said, attack the existing morality of the culture, and then you rebuild it with these new values. So they've got to go into the evangelical churches and disrupt, correct?
Right, disrupt our politics, which disrupt is a buzzword for deconstructionist. They want to tear down the conservative Christian right. We're the target.
Absolutely. All right, here's the next one, the mission statement: to educate and organize Christians for civic and cultural engagement that results in better representation, more just and compassionate policies, and a healthier political culture. So they've openly stated they're going right after Christians. And who's doing this? Michael Ware, who worked with Barack Obama, and the other guy that helped to bring about this is Justin Gaboni. So he was also an Obama delegate, right?
Right.
So the two Obama operatives, open Democrat operatives. I mean, if you search Michael Ware or Justin Gaboni, you will see they are open Democrats. In fact, here's an article from Catholic Social Thought: Faith and the Faithful in the Democratic Party, and it's about Justin Gaboni. We go over to the Christian Post, June 19, 2018. Democrat strategist said he received pushback for urging party to welcome biblical values. Democrat strategist. That's what he says. I mean, so these are Democrat Obama strategists, and they're openly stating in their mission statement that their goal is to go after Christians.
Right. Yeah, and one of the additional statements, he says, urban Christians that are bringing new thinking and new engagement and new politics into the socio-political landscape. Ironically, a lot of the leaders, as we're going to see, are urban pastors whose churches have been planted by the North American Mission Board and Sin Network. That
Which, to interrupt you, North American Mission Board, for those who maybe don't know, that's the Southern Baptist Convention.
Right.
So now we're talking about them penetrating the largest Protestant denomination in America. If we know, Tom, that the power centers for government and policy and brainwashing are government, education, and religion. Government, education, and religion. If you can take over these power centers, you've really accomplished something. Right. So here they're going after religion. Now, it would make sense they go after the Southern Baptist because A, it's the largest Protestant denomination in America. B, it's in the South. And where do they keep losing elections? In the South. They almost elected an open Marxist governor in Florida. An open Marxist governor in Florida in November of 2018. He only lost by 32,000 votes. They almost elected an open Marxist governor in Georgia. She just barely lost, correct?
Right.
What does that tell us?
It tells they're making great strides in the South toward their goals. And you have a guy like Justin Giboney. He actually was introduced to Southern Baptists through the Gospel Coalition and the ERLC during the MLK 50 event, which that was April of 2018 here in Memphis. That was really the game changer for a lot of people among conservative Christians because they realized this is a huge justice narrative and it's not something that we can find a biblical basis to support this. They were really pushing the racial reconciliation narrative, white privilege, all those things. But Giboney was sort of folded in at a time when the AND campaign was not even visible with a website and certainly didn't have its 2020 election statement out there. Clearly, he was being introduced to the mainstream of the conversation in both the Gospel Coalition and the ERLC. Now he's doing articles and interviews with both of those organizations as they continue to push their race and their justice narrative. So this is a key piece of what the left has in mind for the church and how to drag its ideologies into the progressive movement. And so they're selling it as biblical values, but yet they're linking it with something that is completely antithetical, that is the socialist idea of social justice.
And as I stated on radio with you, this is nothing more than Black Lives Matter repackaged for the evangelical church. I mean, their look, it has a Black Lives Matter look with their black backdrop and white writings and their banners and their marches. And then you look at their issues, as we'll look at, it really looks like the three communist ladies that started Black Lives Matter. It looks very similar to the same thing. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Do you agree?
Right. And so then you have to ask, where's the funding coming from?
Yes.
Of course, we know Soros funded Black Lives Matter to the tune of tens of millions. I would imagine that the Obama Foundation is helping fund this or help organize funding for it. And really, this is a big community organizational effort of the evangelical community to pull them in with Michael Ware. And of course, he's called Obama's faith ambassador to America's believers. So that's his current role with the Obama Foundation. So
I want to make sure our audience understands what you just said. Say that again.
That Michael Ware is is Obama's ambassador to America's believers from the Obama Foundation.
So Obama apparently is sending Michael Ware of the AND campaign and Justin Giboney, who also was a Democrat strategist and delegate for Obama, these guys to penetrate the evangelical church, to penetrate Christians. They've already admitted their goal is to go after Christians. And now we look at their preamble, it says 2020 presidential election statement. So it's all about the 2020 election, right?
Right.
Preamble. The upcoming presidential election marks a significant decision point for our nation. This moral moment requires principled conviction from politicians, but even more so from the American people. Christians have a particular obligation to provide this moral leadership. No candidate will be perfect, but Christians can hold both parties accountable to a vision for the common good that is not fully represented in either party platform, end quote. Notice again, common good. That's another word for socialism. Human flourishing, social justice, common good. these are all the same buzzwords. But notice what they're trying to imply. Well, we really don't have the answers with the Democrat Party. We don't have all the answers for the Republican Party. What we really need to do is come together for a third way or a third option. And as we do this broadcast, we're going to see that a lot of the people involved with the AND campaign have openly been openly pushing and promoting things openly called third way. Thesis and antithesis, idea, opposite idea, Republican, Democrat, socialism, capitalism, merge them together, a little bit of both for a third way. That's all this is trying to imply that, hey, we want to have consensus. We want to have dialogue. And if you're a reasonable person, you'll come to the table and you'll talk with us, because this really isn't Republican, it really isn't Democrat. It's people of all stripes in the evangelical Christian churches of America, and we know that Republicans and Democrats go to church together, so why can't we come together and solve the problems? Because the right's not doing it, the left's not doing it, maybe we can come to the middle. It sounds so common sense, doesn't it?
It does. There's some sleight of hand and outright overt deception, because if you look at it, there's no conservative voice in the mix with the AND campaign. It's clear that and there's a little graphic that
look
you
at
have
this.
there.
Explain that.
Church politics. This is the podcast for AND campaign. You have Gaboni on the left, and he's speaking in to the gospel from the red bubble, and then of course Michael Ware from the Obama Foundation speaking for the blue. But there's no red voices here. This is like.
But it gives the impression it's red and blue,
yeah.
And the reason again for
it's a Democratic strategist
Yes.
and Obama Foundation of ambassadors.
And the red-blue would be your state colors on election nights.
Right. And
The red being the Republicans and the blue being the Democrats.
Right. Everybody's come to think of red and blue, when they think of politics and how the votes are divided. But very deceptive that they would have that. And Gaboni is a popular character. For him to be with Olasky on the campus of Patrick Henry College.
Well, let's go to that slide. Let's go ahead and show that picture, because again, that's very shocking to think that he's sitting there, Marvin Olasky with Gaboni on shocking Patrick Henry College, which has been traditionally known as a, kind of a founding fathers, traditional values, constitutional, constitutionalist would attend there. Homeschoolers, a lot of homeschoolers.
Right.
This is very troubling here.
It is troubling, and Olasky, as I said, is a very trusted source for the news in his job at World Magazine. But here he's embracing the social justice narrative. They talk about it a lot and he refers people to the website. He asked Gaboni who he would recommend that conservative Christians read in order to gain a better understanding of the other side. He recommends CNN's resident communist, Van Jones, as a great place for conservative Christians to get a take on.
Marvin Olasky of World Magazine does.
No, Gaboni does.
Gaboni does.
Yes. But he does this in the format in response to Olasky's question. They're also
and he doesn't get any pushback from Olasky?
No, there's no pushback. This is a very welcome narrative, and he's promoting it to the students at Patrick Henry College. So this is troubling when you see what is considered to be one of the most standard conservative institutions being willing to host a narrative like this. And sadly, during the Q&A, you can see that he's very popular, both of these guys, very popular with the young students there and respected by them. And there was no conservative voice of opposition to any of this from any of the students.
Well, we knew World Magazine was going down a long time ago, in my opinion. We used to advertise with them our Worldview weekends across the country, even put their magazines out on our chairs in the 90s and early 2000s. I got an email September 7th, 2012 from one of the leaders at World Magazine. We'd advertised there for years, and they said, this lady, Dawn, writing to Alan, they're both working at World Magazine, and Dawn wants Alan to say, send this on to me in 2012. After reviewing Brannon's website this morning, unfortunately, we will not be able to accept the email advertisement. That would be for our Worldview Weekend conferences. In reviewing the website, I found the paragraph, certain men have stepped in unnoticed. I'm quoting from Jude.
Yeah.
The following statement within the paragraph does conflict with our advertising policy. Quote, this is again quoting from my website, quote, well-known evangelical and pro-family leaders have joined in events, alliances, and common causes with a shocking array of unbiblical partners. I mean, this is 2012 I was wearing on my website. They took issue with, and what's Marvin Olasky doing of World Magazine? And they don't want to advertise our conferences back in 2012. This is when we knew they had gone to the dogs, in my opinion. Well-known evangelical pro-family leaders have joined in events, alliances, and common causes with a shocking array of unbiblical partners. As a result, many contemporary Christian leaders embrace and encourage the false Jesus and false gospel of Mormonism, the New Age movement, Roman Catholicism, Word of Faith teachers, the New Apostolic Reformation, Eastern mysticism, and the spiritual left. Also, several folks are in quote. That's quoting my website. Why would they have a problem me pointing out the false Jesus of Mormonism or the New Age movement? And then they write. Also, several folks are mentioned in the video link included, like Rick Warren. Oops, I guess we can't touch Rick Warren because again he's pushing the three-legged stool. Apparently, Marvin Olasky was into the three-legged stool, right?
Yeah.
So we can't touch Rick Warren back in 2012 to World. And then they say, our advertising policy as formed by our publisher does not allow for placement of products that take issue with other Christians. Following is the statement referencing this policy. Quote, when an advertiser's products, especially books, videos, and tapes, take issue with other Christians, the ads must be respectful in tone. In other words, we'll leave room for disagreement, even vigorous disagreement, but inflammatory words, especially like false and myth, when applied to other Christians, won't normally be allowed, end quote. Really, so there's a problem saying false gospel of Mormonism. I didn't think Mormons would be considered Christians, but maybe apparently so. Or New Agers. I mean, so please let Brannon know that this is in no way judgment of his books, but we must be consistent with our advertising policies with all advertising and must adhere to the policy in this situation. So there you go. World Magazine, September 7, 2012, telling us, hey, we won't let you advertise with us because I guess we can't talk about the false Christ and false gospel of Mormonism and New Age movement or whatever, or point out people like Rick Warren. So we knew that in 2012 that the magazine, I guess, that Alinsky is with here, Marvin Olasky. Might as well be Alinsky, right?
I think that was a Freudian slip.
That's a Freudian slip that Marvin Olasky's with was already going down. And here he is sitting at Patrick Henry College with Justin Gaboni of the AND campaign, who's a Democrat strategist, worked for Obama as a delegate, and is repackaged by, I think, Black Lives Matter for the Evangelical Church.
Well, and a little history on Olasky, for those who don't know who he is. He was a quote-unquote card-carrying communist by the time he was 24 in university. And he was reportedly converted by reading a copy of the New Testament in Russian. And so he's marketed heavily as the former Marxist.
Then he ought to recognize all this.
Evangelical leader. He absolutely should. There's no way that he doesn't recognize it for what it is. And of course, the same hypocrisy with them not wanting you talking about Rick Warren when it's him, it's Olasky who sold the faith-based partnerships to the government. Of course, we see that hypocrisy now as he's sitting with Gaboni promoting Marxism and Marxianity when he himself knows exactly what it is.
I love that term, Marxianity. Someone should write a book with that.
I think you need to write your next book on hypocrisy.
Exactly.
Because that's what's overwhelming about these people, that we look at it and we think, okay, how do they expect us not to see this?
Yeah.
And I think Olasky goes a long way with his credibility based on his testimony, but that testimony itself shows that he would be deeply indoctrinated and trained in this as much as Michael Ware or any of these other operatives were. So what is he doing promoting this as a conservative, respected voice in Christian circles? As best I recall, he is still in Austin, Texas, and he's an elder of a PCA church plant there. He promotes all these guys, but obviously we're seeing the cracks in that foundation and the facade that was represented to us as conservative Christian evangelical voices. More and more of these guys we see are not at all who they were projected and marketed to be.
Absolutely not. And so, again, you mentioned the PCA, Presbyterian Church of America. We've mentioned the Southern Baptists. Some of the guys with the AND campaign are involved in church plants with the North American Mission Board, Southern Baptist Convention. So two big denominations, Southern Baptist Convention and Presbyterian Churches of America, they're going down. Yeah. Now, what's very interesting is that Marvin Olasky's at Patrick Henry College. The problem is the homeschool movement largely was not built on a solid theological foundation when it began as a whole. Not that individual families weren't, and that there weren't some organizations and homeschool groups that were. But as a whole, the whole movement really was based on the idea of Reconstructionism. The Reconstructionists, the Dominionists were the ones really pushing at the beginning the homeschool movement. And of course, Reconstructionism and that whole movement is largely based on the idea of ushering in the kingdom of God, dominion theology, kingdom now theology, which of course social justice would be a part of that. So we're not shocked, frankly, to see that the homeschool movement is collapsing. And you're here sitting at Patrick Henry College, which is supposed to be a conservative school that largely attracts homeschool students. and graduates, is now interviewing a guy like Justin Gaboni, not to mention other things we could get into, but we won't now. Again, it shows the foundations. If you don't have a solid foundation, eventually it's going to rot and collapse. Well, when it's largely based on the false premise of Reconstructionism, that we can reconstruct a Christian society and rebuild it if we just all homeschool our kids and then channel them into these careers and these power centers, we can take the 7 mountain mandates, the 7 spears of great cultural influence, and take over the culture in the country. Well, that's not what's in the Bible. Jesus brings his kingdom. God brings his kingdom, Daniel 2. We don't establish it. So when you look at people like Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis, who have been booted out of some homeschool conferences, you look at some of the homeschool curriculum being written to comply with Common Core. Now you see this social justice reconstructionist concept and idea becoming ever more prevalent. You can kind of see that we're losing a lot of our great institutions and structures we used to count on. World Magazine, homeschool groups, Patrick Henry College, a lot of the things, PCA, Southern Baptist Convention. We're losing a lot of groups to this.
Yeah, and we're losing our children to it if we're not paying attention. Our adult children who are going into these Christian higher education institutions and some of the other stuff we talked about. I mean, we can see Wheaton, Fuller, and a lot of these institutions being completely taken over with this AND campaign style narrative and lending their people to it. Campus Crusade, InterVarsity, others. But what's sad to me is that at some point you would think that Christian adults would stand up and say enough. And it's my prayer that we're moving toward that as more people become aware. And as I mentioned, Gaboni came into our conversation when MLK 50 took place. That's what brought about the Dallas statement and some of the other pushback against social justice. So the awareness is being raised that something is a problem. But that's why your program and Marxianity and work like you're doing right now are so important, because people need to realize what's at stake. It's your children's future. It's your faith. It's their faith. And so the nation as we know it will collapse without the salt and light of Christian voters and really convictional voting. And so they're trying to substitute that with this AND campaign ideology. Obviously, they're using the urban movement for reasons we would understand. With Agenda 2030, everything is being driven toward urbanization and toward urban development, sustainable development. So this would be seen as a key place for the church to find its own place in sustainability and sustainable society. And of course, they're planning these urban churches with Southern Baptists and other conservatives funding that they're giving to missions. And ironically, the leadership that we're seeing in the AND campaign directly reflects Gospel Coalition, younger, second-generation leaders, and their churches, their urban churches, have been planted through the North American Mission Board and its SEND network.
And this is what I talk about in Marxianity, and I quote Tom in here, because we've been warning forever that they're turning these churches into social justice centers where they'll be able to get government money. Right. They just won't be able to mention Jesus, pass out the Bible, no proselytization will be allowed. But if they set up social service centers in these churches, they'll be able to get local, state, and federal money, we've discussed in previous programs, including in our documentary Siege at siegethemovie.com. Tom is featured in that, siegethemovie.com. And one of the areas they're sieging is our churches, to flip them. And what we see is the Catholic charities, as I document in Marxianity, the Catholic charities in America, over 60% of their funding comes from local, state, and federal government. So they're just being a middle person for the government. And this is really how they're going to push social justice, put these churches in the inner cities, move everybody there, and then offer social services. And they'll collect a lot of money by being a middle person for local, state, and federal government through socialism, redistribution of wealth. It'll be renamed compassion, love, public-private partnerships, and other things. But we have to move along. Here's a screenshot of Justin Gaboni. It says he was a delegate for the Democratic National Committee, or Convention, and he served as the co-chair of Obama for America's Gen 44 Atlanta Initiative. Here's Michael Ware. We've already mentioned him as well as one of President Obama's ambassadors to America's believers. Michael directed faith outreach for President Obama's historic 2012 re-election campaign. Now look at this. Doesn't that look a lot like the very colors and posters and banners of Black Lives Matter? And we know they're taking on some of the very same issues as the Black Lives Matter people, and we'll get into that. Here again is their 2020 statement overview. And again, this is where we get into sounding a lot like Agenda 2030 of Sustainable Development of the United Nations, which is international socialism, which was introduced in Rio in the early 90s and signed onto by George H. Bush, and then picked up by Clinton and furthered all through these other administrations. Now, here again sounds a lot like the Black Lives Matter or Agenda 2030, anti-poverty programs and pro-family economic policies with a focus on women and children. So again, it's going to be about redistribution of wealth, mandatory minimum incomes. We'll get into that. Racial equality in education, housing, criminal justice. Now, these all sound good, but these are all buzzwords, and we'll get into that. Religious liberty, protection for those who maintain the historic Christian sexual ethic, and protection for LGBT people at the workplace and housing. So again, here's that. Well, we want to protect the LGBTQ, but we want to protect the religious community, and so we need to come together and find common ground. How do you find common ground between the cultural Marxist LGBTQ that want to put in hate crime laws, stop us from saying anything against this concept and idea on the radio, as is the case in Canada? I mean, how do you find common ground with Marxists? Right. You can't, and that's what. But they're taking all of the victim coalitions of Herbert Marcuse, the sexual minorities, the feminists, the poor, the immigrants, turning them into a victim coalition, and then say, who's oppressing you? The Christians and the capitalists. Well, here they come along and say, well, let's prove we're not racist. Let's prove we're not xenophobic. Let's prove that we're not sexist or chauvinist or bigots or whatever by bringing our Christian ethic to the table and meeting them in the middle. And if you don't, then apparently you are a racist, which is why you guys have been voting for Donald Trump, and you better not vote for him in 2020 if you really want to embrace biblical values and social justice, right?
Right. And of course, if you don't embrace these things, you're just not compassionate. You don't really care about people. That was something that Gaboni kept saying in the interview with Alaska. He said, well, if you can't show people that you care about them, they're not going to listen to you. So that's the narrative. It's compassion, it's gospel concern, it's our great social awareness of the needs around us. But we look at some of these talking points. I call this the tulip of the AND campaign, the 5 points. We just need to make up the acronym for it.
Well, the other one is accessible and affordable health care and respect for the dignity of life at all stages, including the unborn, and yet they never say abortion should be illegal. So again, what they use it as is to say, if you're pro-life, you should be for more funding.
Right.
So give more money to the single mother so she doesn't have to have an abortion. Yet they never say they want abortion to be illegal. So again, it's a bait and switch. It's total subterfuge.
Well, let me comment on that. The hypocrisy with Michael Ware being involved in the AND campaign and this narrative basically about abortion being discouraged but not outlawed. It was his boss, Barack Obama, who by 2013, both for domestic and international promotion of abortion, had boosted the funding, federal tax funding, to over $530 million a year.
For abortions.
For abortions.
Well, look who's on the elders. Ron Sider and Richard Mao. Richard Mao of Fuller Seminary, which is where Rick Warren came from, and they're involved in all kinds of liberal...
Drucker taught there. That's where Drucker met Warren.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So they're involved in the whole third way concept at Fuller big time, along with a lot of other garbage. Ron Sider, he's basically promoted Marxism, cultural Marxism, and things with Jim Wallace and Tony Campolo for years that is promoting the Marxists down in Central America and other things. I mean, the things that Ron Sider said about traditional conservative evangelicals, I mean, these guys run around calling us demons and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, well, as you know, every time you start unraveling these networks, you're going to find Ron Sider there. If it's pushing progressive politics and social justice and this entire narrative of progressive Christianity, you're going to find Ron Sider there. He's key leader.
There's Richard Mao and Ron Sider. Now we go back through some of my other books, and because I remembered this, and I went and grabbed this screenshot. This is The Third Way. It was what it was called, The Third Way. Come, let us reason together. A fresh look at shared cultural values between evangelicals and progressives. Now this was several years ago. A group got together and said, how can we meet in the middle? Just like Michael Ware and Justin Gaboni are doing. And progressives and evangelicals. Progressives is another word for socialist. How can socialists and evangelicals come together? That's that Hegelian, right? That pitting opposites against each other. They merge and you find dialogue and consensus. And if you don't, you're intolerant, you're a bigot, you're not a team player, you're a fascist, whatever. And who's involved in that years ago? Richard Mao and Ron Sider. So would we be shocked they're involved in the AND campaign, which is really the same concept? Let's take the evangelicals and the progressives and find a middle ground. And all they're really trying to do is tell you that you can be a good Christian and be a Marxist and vote for the Democrats, right? That's really the end game, right?
Right, exactly. And that this third way sweet spot exists when actually there are no conservative voices there in it. The only conservatives who would be drawn into it are those who are suckered in to believing that it is genuine, that it is something that would actually further the gospel. You notice that Jonathan Merritt's name was on this Come Let Us Reason Together in the book for Where. He credits Jonathan Merritt with being one of the mentors of this book.
Oh, wow.
Of course, he's the son of a former Southern Baptist president who was outed in 2011 for a homosexual relationship with a blogger, and he has never been cut away from the opportunity to continue to speak into Christian and conservative evangelical circles. He's the guy we've talked about saying that the Christians' views on LGBT are like unbaked cookies. And so we keep saying that. These guys are just baking the cookies. That's what ANCampaign is doing. They're baking the cookies of the political engagement for conservative evangelicals and moving them further and further left until they're overdone and done. Out.
And what this really is brainwashing.
Yeah, it is brainwashing.
It's brainwashing, which, whether you call it brainwashing, information operation, information warfare, political warfare, psychological warfare, no matter what you call it, the end game is influence.
Yeah.
Having influence, nudging people, nudging and influence is the name of the game. And when you start using masking terms, and now you're going to talk about Jesus and the scriptures and the Christian values and biblical values, and you're going to wet it with socialism, social justice, and progressive, this is nothing more than information warfare being brought to bear on the American church, American evangelicals largely, particularly in the South, because Gaboni's out of Georgia.
Right.
So they're going after the South because, again, you look at the Electoral College and you see all these red states, and if they're going to have a revolution in America and win elections, they've got to grab some of these red states. Hillary Clinton supposedly won the popular vote, but she lost the Electoral College to Donald Trump. So they've got to flip Florida. They've got to flip Georgia, particularly if Trump in 2016, what did he do? Didn't he win Michigan and Wisconsin?
I don't remember.
I think he did. So if he's going to win, these more Rust Belt states, they've got to try to make up for it in his territory or the Southern territory. But even for any presidential election coming along, they've got to flip these Southern states, or they're never going to be able to continually win elections. Not to mention House seats, Senate seats, governor's offices, governor mansions. This is about a revolution, but they're going to now penetrate the church, which is so ironic because for so long they told us the church was too political. We're too political. We're too political. And now all of a sudden, whether it's the Gospel Coalition, the Southern Baptist Convention, Ethics Religious Liberty Commission, all these guys, what are they doing? They're being hyper-political, but outright Marxist, cultural Marxist, and working with Democrat strategists.
Right. And I would caution people to watch closely. If their pastors are quoting from any of these guys, especially on a regular basis, they're reading some of the wrong stuff.
Yeah.
And of course, what we see with the young urban pastors that are part of the leadership of this, a lot of them have been discipled by guys like Tim Keller and Russell Moore. They hold them in high esteem. So within the evangelical community, you see how deeply penetrated this is.
So this is the fruit of Marxianity.
It really is. It really is. And this is, they've been playing a long game here. They've been at it for a while, and now even the conservative Christians, supposedly conservative, biblical conservatives, theologically committed, they're sounding more and more like an Obama operative, and that they can hook arms with a Democratic delegate and Obama's faith ambassador and take your money to plant their churches and pay their salaries in these urban churches, and then engage in these marches and push for social justice.
And these churches are nothing more than social justice churches. That's all they are.
They're 1,000 points of community organization is what they are.
Look at this. Do you believe the Bible is true and social justice is required? You're not alone. Orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Now, those are two words we love to use. Orthodoxy and orthopraxy. So if you're really going to live out your orthodox, your biblical orthodoxy into orthopraxy, you better embrace socialism. I mean, again, what an oxymoron. What an absolute lie. But notice again the emphasis on and campaign. Now, a lot of faces here. Who are some of these people? Well, first one here is I support the and campaign. and that is D.A. Horton. Is he with the Gospel Coalition?
Yes, he's with the Gospel Coalition and the Ethics and Religious Liberties Commission of Russell Moore.
Inside the Southern Baptist Convention.
Inside the Southern Baptist Convention. And he works with Send Network as one of their key urban strategists for church planting for North American Mission Board. He planted a church in Long Beach, California, is where he is currently.
And here is Alan Noble. Now, Alan is with the AND campaign. He's listed on their website as one of their leaders. And yet Alan wrote an article for the Gospel Coalition that I read about in the book Marxianity. When I saw him, like, wait a minute, I know that name. I had to rack my brain to remember how I remembered Alan Noble. And sure enough, he's in Marxianity and some of our TV shows because he wrote this screenshot, this article. Here's a screenshot of it. I've shown you this so many times on TV. 2014, is there a case for racial reparations? And notice it's right on the Gospel Coalition website. And indeed, he says, after reading The Atlantic and an article called The Case for Reparations, he says, but after reading Coates' powerful and enlightening piece, it's hard for me to imagine not demanding reparations of some kind or another for the hundreds of years of government-sanctioned abuse suffered by blacks in our country. Well, it was abuse, but not everybody was involved. And again, I'm not going to go into it now. I do in the book Marxianity. How are you going to carry out reparations? Most of the people in America weren't involved in slavery. What are you going to do with the fact that you had black families owning slaves? You had blacks involved in enslaving blacks in Africa, capturing them, and then the Muslims would bring them to the shore and to the coastline in the slave ships that would then transport them. So are you going to do this to black families as well that were involved in the trade, who were black slave owners in America, which I document in Marxianity? Even a well-known black professor and progressive admits this. It's in Marxianity. What about the Muslim families that were involved? We can track them down. And haven't we done reparations really with affirmative action and government programs and welfare state? But this is nothing more than socialism. This is nothing more than class warfare. And yet who's pushing it? Alan Noble with the Gospel Coalition, who's part of the AND campaign. Well, then here's another gal.
Well, let me speak to this too. This is why critical race theory has come into prominence in the Southern Baptist Convention, so they can push this narrative toward reparations and toward the redistribution of wealth. So many of the ministries that we see that were once driven by true evangelism and missions and the gospel are now being driven by this reparations narrative.
And you said critical race theory, which is really political correctness. That's the cultural Marxist we write about and have talked about since November '97. We did our first hour on the Frankfurt School at a Worldview Weekend in Minneapolis, St. Paul in November 1997. And they came to America pushing political correctness, cultural Marxism, critical race theory that basically said the source of all suffering and oppression is Christians and capitalists, a patriarchal society, white men. Correct?
Right, and that's why you see with critical race theory the presumption of guilt because you're white, the white privilege, and institutionally, the institution of being of white or of Christianity in itself, both of those are guilty and complicit. So even if you deny a personal involvement or racist ideas or involvement in racism, you're guilty by association just by being white or just by being an American evangelical.
And again, the bottom line of that narrative is simply to destroy Christianity and capitalism. Christianity and capitalism, and say the source of all suffering and oppression is Christianity and capitalism.
And of course to exploit the church's resources.
Yeah, it's to say now don't you feel guilty? Don't you feel guilty that you're supposed to have some kind of white guilt now and cough up your money to make reparations and make atonement for, I guess, the sins of people years and years and years ago, or maybe even no one even connected to your family ever.
All right.
Here, tell me about her, Corey Porter. She's part of the AND campaign.
Yeah, she's one of the executive leadership team with Gaboni and with Michael Ware, and she actually is part of the Gospel Coalition herself. So the Gospel Coalition is heavily represented here in the leadership.
Well, here's another screenshot. We're talking about D.A. Horton. Who else here is represented with the Gospel Coalition?
Well, Preston Perry, you may know his wife better than him. His wife is Jackie Hill Perry, who's one of the favorite ERLC and Gospel Coalition talkers, speakers.
She wrote a book, right?
Yeah, Gay Girl, Good God was her book. And she's one of the same-sex attracted, but in her case, married to a heterosexual. And so these two are activists within the SBC and within the Gospel Coalition. So he's one of the leaders. He's a poet. These other guys you see there are church planters with whose churches and salaries.
Which ones? Which of those?
The other three there.
Ford, Lindsay, and Agabu.
Yeah, and these guys all have Gospel Coalition and North American Mission Board support.
So I want to make sure that people understand North American Mission Board, again, that's Southern Baptist.
Southern Baptist.
So the common theme here is Southern Baptist Convention and the Gospel Coalition. And again, it's very imperative for them to go after the Southern Baptist Convention if they're going to flip voters in the South, because obviously there are a lot of Southern Baptist churches in the South.
Well, being a part of the leadership of AND campaign means that these young urban pastors are activists. They are racial, political activists.
All right, Tom, who's this guy?
This is John Onwuchekwa. He is works with the Nine Marks, with Mark Dever, and Jonathan Lehman, who we've talked a lot about. He is one of the urban church planters, pastors in Atlanta, but he's also working with Sin Network, North American Mission Board. And so he's one of the key leaders of the Nine Marks church planting arm, which plants these basically these social justice churches.
And we've done a lot of TV warning about Mark Dever and his group. Now, you know this guy from having run into him when you went to the Southern Baptist Convention as one of our reporters a few years ago.
Right. Well, actually last year. This past June, he was on the stage for the cooperative program, which North American Mission Board, being interviewed along with Walter Strickland, who is the guy from Southeastern Seminary who is teaching James Cone in the seminary and who is openly part of the movement to bring critical race theory into the Southern Baptist Convention through their Resolution 9. So these guys are all activists. They're Gospel Coalition guys. In this case with John, he's also Nine Marks. So the overlap in this is intensely disturbing, because all of these organizations are feeding their players in who are nothing more than activist community organizers as pastors.
So he was on the stage at the Southern Baptist Convention with Walter Strickland.
Right.
And those you remember, the New York Times article, April 20, 2019, had a whole article on Walter Strickland, who's at Danny Akin's Southern Baptist Seminary in North Carolina.
And he was being interviewed by John Akin, who is Danny Akin's son, on this cooperative program stage.
And Walter Strickland runs and speaks to all these, he's a black gentleman, right, Walter Strickland? Yeah. And he runs and he speaks to all these Southern Baptist churches and institutions, and he quotes Cone, who is considered the father of black liberation theology. He's not the father of liberation theology, he's the father of black liberation theology. And liberation theology is the mixture of socialism with Christianity for Marxianity. And he says in the article in the New York Times that he doesn't tell the churches when he's talking to them who he's quoting. He doesn't tell them he's quoting Cone, the father of black liberation theology. And what he's trying to tell them is basically the article is about how evangelical Christians are bringing him in because they're all disturbed, according to the New York Times article, about the racism of Donald Trump and the xenophobia of Donald Trump. And so they're bringing him in to try to tell people, you know, what they need to do to correct their racism. So here's what's going on, folks. A false narrative is being set up. The false narrative is, if you believe in national sovereignty, national borders, vetting illegal immigrants, you are not for socialism, you're not for big government, redistribution of wealth, you're a racist, you're xenophobic, you're afraid of foreigners, you're Islamophobic, you have a fear of Islam and jihadis, and to prove you're not a racist, then you need to come together and be involved in socialism. So prove you're not a racist and not a bigot by being involved in empowering people, social justice, redistribution of wealth, right?
Right.
So they set up a false narrative and then say, now prove you're not a racist by embracing socialism.
Right. You jump the hurdle that we've set in front of you. But interesting with John, I actually saw Jonathan Lehman, who is one of his bosses there at the Nine Marks with Dever's organization. I saw Lehman actually coaching John before he went on that stage with the cooperative program with the North American Mission Board. He was coaching him for what he would say, how he would say it. I overheard this conversation. It was over an hour that I was in the region around the Nine Marks booth, and you could see them huddled over in the edge and Lehman coaching him for that upcoming dialogue.
We're running out of time. Let's get this one real quick. Charlie Dates, who's that?
Yeah, he's a pastor of Progressive Baptist Church, and he is pushing, he's actually on the AND campaign speaking at Southern Seminary.
Is he a Gospel Coalition guy too?
Yeah, he's a Gospel Coalition guy.
All right, looky here. We go to healthcare and abortion, and as you read it, it has nothing about ending abortion. It just talks about social good and more funding for healthcare, affordable healthcare. Immigration, it says the Trump administration has failed to treat undocumented immigrants with dignity, care, especially at the U.S.-Mexican border. How so? How? I I mean, these people have no responsibility for breaking the law and coming over the border?
Well, if you're a Christian and you haven't figured out the politics of immigration and what's really going on here, just look one layer behind it with open border societies that are funding
George Soros. It talks about especially in protecting dreamers. Trump hasn't done that, and upholding long-standing laws regarding refugees fleeing violence, lawlessness, and oppression. And of course, the problem is most of these people aren't. And why are we not doing this with Christians over in Iraq or Iran or in other parts of the world who are under assault by the Muslims? Poor and pro-family economics. He talks about that workers should receive a livable wage. Well, now we're talking about mandatory minimum incomes here, folks. Education should be accessible and equitable for all children, so I guess basically free education. And then we ended with a slide here of showing you how mainstream this is becoming, and that's the whole premise is it's becoming so mainstream. You're even finding positive interviews with Gaboni of the AND campaign by Marvin Alasky of World Magazine at Patrick Henry College. So as we conclude, the point is this. They're trying to carry out a revolution in America, and they realize they must use information warfare, information operations. They must flip people, convince them to hold to constitutional ideas and values and national sovereignty and free market principles is racism. It's systemic racism. And if you want to be a good Christian and a good American, you better join the AND campaign, social justice, biblical values and social justice, and really marry these two ideas of biblical values and socialism together, which is what I call Marxianity. You know, Tom, it all does come back to Marxianity for these guys, mixing Marxism with Christianity.
Yeah, it really does. And they're able to empower this narrative by pulling people's emotions. And the narrative is false. There is so much hypocrisy in the works here. And like I said, there's not even a conservative voice in the mix with AND campaign. There's faux conservatives who are promoting AND campaign, but that's what's revealing. And you have to realize they're not only after your vote, they're out to redefine your faith. What goes out with this AND campaign is the gospel. They might call it biblical values, but they're not representing the gospel in this cause. Third way is not a gospel posture. Christians may feel good about thinking that they're coming to the middle and they're getting along with everybody. They're preserving civility, but these are the narratives of deception. These are the narratives of those who want to steal your vote, your children, and your future.
And there's nothing biblical about stealing from people. Stealing their money, mandatory incomes, reparations, free education. Someone has to pay for all it. It's not free. Free health care. That's stealing. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not covet. There's nothing biblical on these values. That's what's so ironic is they're dressing up socialism and communism as Christian values, biblical values and social justice. And again, it's shocking the people that are helping promote this, but it's what we've been warning about for a very, very long time. And the heat is on for 2020 election. And so again, be very aware of who you can and cannot trust anymore, folks. It's getting smaller and smaller, the group you can trust. Well, Tom, thank you for being with us. We'll look forward to doing some more programs while you're here.
Thank you, Brannon.
His website is 30piecesofsilver.org. It's been under his name throughout the program, 30piecesofsilver.org. Now, if you appreciate this broadcast, folks, we're one of the few groups doing this. Remember to support us with your tax-deductible contributions, please, at WVW-Foundation.com, WVW-Foundation.com. It is tax-deductible. And you can also send a check. You'll find our mailing address on the screen as well as on our website, or by using the phone number on our website, WVW-Foundation.com. We are a listener-supported organization and broadcast network, either through the foundation or by being a member of our VIP club, where you'll find all of my books as an ebook, our conference DVDs, and years of television, all archived, and radio at situationroom.net, situationroom.net. Till next time, I'm Brannon Howse. Thanks for watching. Take care.